Moody's credit rating agency has lauded Eskom's plans to reduce its debt as a move that can decrease the risk for South Africa. Referring to the South African government's announcement in February of a plan to provide its struggling power utility debt relief and potentially write off municipalities' arrears to Eskom Holdings SOC Limited, Moody's Investor Service said this will ultimately improve liquidity and cut funding risks for the government. The proposed 254 billion rand, that's about $13.6 billion of relief announced in February's budget, is aimed at strengthening Eskom's balance sheet and covering all interest payments over the next 3 years, provided it brings in private partners to help operate its plants and the electricity transmission network. So this morning, joining me to discuss this is Tshepo, Kgadima, an energy expert. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and greetings to your viewers right across the continent of Africa.
All right, so Eskom has been surviving on state bailouts for years now, and Moody's seems to be in support of such bailouts. Now, another one is coming into place for Eskom. Are you also in support of these kinds of bailouts, and do you think that it would help the power utility balance its sheets, as been speculated?
Look, it was inevitable for the government, as the wholly, the sole shareholder of this power utility called Eskom, to have done what it has done now in terms of a bailout. Because under our laws, any state-owned company is not permitted to default. And if it defaults on any of its debt obligations, the state has to come in and be able to pay off whatever debt obligations the state-owned company has. So as early as 2018, I have written extensively to warn that this situation was to happen. At the time, Eskom had a debt of just over 250 billion rand. That debt, we've seen it increase over the years to now at 432 billion rand. However, most of the bonds that Eskom took years earlier are maturing from 2023 to 2025. It was therefore inevitable that, taking into account the current liquidity crisis that Eskom finds itself in, it would not have been able to service or pay off or redeem those bonds as they mature and continue to pay interest on the bonds that are currently still have got a few more years to run. So, taking into account the current liquidity crisis, the government had to come in. Will this be a solution?
Tshepo,
to perform below the expectation.
All right. So, yeah, so I understand what you said, Tshepo, and all that. But then I'd like to also find out from you, 250 billion rand is what the government is hoping to put down out of the 423 billion rand that Eskom owes in debt. Now, don't you think that that could be biting into the treasury or the government's purse, as the case may be? Because this is not the first time that we're seeing this kind of bailouts come to Eskom. So don't you think it could be, it could translate into a financial constraint, even for the government that's trying to provide this money?
Well, it's certainly going to, I think, add more pressure. We have to take into account that the government of South Africa, specifically through its national treasury, has adopted the failed theory of deficit financing, or have misapplied the theory of deficit financing. So we've seen that this debt bailout for Eskom, is the proceeds from it are not coming from tax collection or tax revenues, but they are coming from actually the state now itself being the borrower, who will in turn then use those proceeds from the bond issuances to do the so-called bailout. It does not fix as I say, the operational inefficiencies, the very difficult market conditions where Eskom finds itself in, where it is continuing to experience a sales decline. Right now is the middle of winter. They were expecting electricity demand to be around 37,000 megawatts at peak period of morning and evening. It does not exceed 29,000 megawatts. So we're seeing a utility that continues to be under pressure which cannot turn into positive cash flows and profitability, notwithstanding the very exorbitant tariffs that it has been demanding from the regulator, NERSA. So in anything, this is a stopgap measure. So the 254 billion, what I suspect is that in the next year or two, we will see government having to shore up the Eskom in terms of its operational losses, whereby this current financial year, they estimate that they will have a 21 billion rand EBITDA loss. And when you take into account that there are further write-offs that Eskom has to have, impairment charges, which will equate to another 50 or so billion rand. So the situation is very difficult. So we should not be surprised if government will have to once again, in the next year or two, have to come up with another 100 to 150 billion rand additional to be able to improve the liquidity position of Eskom, which remains very precarious.
All right, so Tshepo, this actually brings me to this question to understand that what is actually the bane of Eskom's problems? Is it leadership inefficiencies? Of course, remember Andrew de Ruyter was the ex-CEO who has been blamed for the utilities' years of misfortune. Or does it have to do with financial inadequacy to properly run the institution? Or maybe the lack of expertise leading to operational deficiency? What is actually the crux of Eskom's problem?
Look, the tariffs have become higher, so the equilibrium has been breached, whereby it now costs less to produce power from alternative sources than to secure or procure power from Eskom as a utility. Eskom continues to also engage in very irresponsible practices, such as those of wanting to procure more of its power supply from independent power producers who are charging Eskom 6.5 times more than Eskom's own primary energy costs, whereby Eskom is paying around 2.28 rand a kilowatt hour when it costs Eskom only 44 cents a kilowatt hour to produce. So those are some of the problems. And secondly is, of course, the whole age-old problem of rampant corruption and looting. Right now, as we stand here, Eskom loses in a minimum of 109 billion rand a year due to rampant corruption and looting. And there doesn't appear to be any appetite to actually factor of Eskom declining even further. That also exacerbates the problem, because that in turn means that lesser energy sales, electricity unit sales, and the lesser electricity unit sales means, of course, that the losses, the operating losses, are going to continue unabated. So it's a cocktail of problems which, at the moment, there doesn't appear to be the gumption. The board and management of Eskom don't appear to be alive to these realities, which at the end of the day mean that we will see a Eskom that is much more smaller in terms of revenues. We'll see a Eskom that is much more smaller in terms of the electricity provided to the nation, but a Eskom that will have obligations in terms of the power purchase agreements it has signed with independent power producers for the next 20 years. So effectively, Eskom in a short order of time will not be a going concern if the current trajectory is maintained of very absurd decisions in as far as
Hello, Tshepo, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay, all right. So on top of these and the cost of production that Eskom would have to bear the cost, we still see that there are some municipalities and some other public and private institutions that actually owe Eskom money between 3.6 billion and 7.1 billion rand is what some of these municipalities are owing. And as of December 2022, about 56 billion rand is being owed Eskom for power being provided by this public utility. So why is it that you have these municipalities and all these establishments owing as much as this, which of course would add to the financial constraints of Eskom? Why are they not paying?
Well, look, in the first instance, the municipalities have got no business whatsoever distributing electricity. That is one of the sources of the problems that Eskom is facing. Eskom should sell electricity directly to the consumer. Eskom should have a direct line of control on who its customers are and what those customers pay, and directly receive that. So the intermediation whereby the Eskom continues to rely on the middleman, whether it is a municipality, whether it is the electricity resellers, is something that should have been done away a long time ago, and continued reliance on municipalities as intermediaries, continued reliance on the private sector, wholesalers and resellers who are actually middlemen, intermediaries adding no value. Unfortunately, it's going to mean that we will see a Eskom that continues to be plagued by a liquidity crisis. Cash flows are not going to be positive. They continue to have negative cash flows, and therefore have to rely on the very same government to now have to effectively shore up its operating losses.
All right. Now, Tshepo, now the finance minister, that is Enoch Godongwane, earlier said that there would be no more future bailouts for Eskom, stressing that Eskom must comply with the conditions of the debt relief. So what would you say are those conditions of the debt relief, and how do you think that Eskom can achieve the objectives of ensuring low costs, provide reliable electricity, and increase efficiency of its operations?
Well, in the first instance, government will always have an obligation. So I don't understand where the minister gets an impression that they can say, well, Eskom now will be on its own following this 254. For as long as the politicians continue to unlawfully interfere in the due running and operation of Eskom, Eskom will continue to have the problems that it has. Eskom has not demonstrated that it can be able to go back to the glory days where it hires competent managers, where meritocracy is the key, where people who are put in charge, whether policy making, whether operational control of the entity, or even board governance, oversight, and board strategy, those must be people of good repute, experience, expertise, people who are hired on meritocracy. Unfortunately, at the moment, we have that problem, which is motivated more by the urge to loot at all costs. And the looting manifests in the policies of procurement, where you procure redundant power which cannot be used in any shape or form, where you procure at 6.5 times what it costs you to produce as a utility, as Eskom, and the management that is in dereliction of fiduciary duty in terms of Companies Act, where they are not paying due attention to ensuring that they can, their loyalty should be to the entity, the enterprise, Eskom and Eskom alone, and therefore cut down the 109 billion rand of corruption, improve the operational efficiencies, which currently they are very lacking. Their energy availability factor is around 60%, we are told, but if Eskom stuck to the knitting, meaning the use of coal, and Eskom should actually stick to using coal to generate electricity, because the benchmark cost is 44 cents a kilowatt hour. Any other alternative energy source comes in at a minimum of 2.28 rand, and in some instances over 5 rand. So the options in terms of Eskom for use are limited, and they are limited to coal and nuclear, but nuclear has got an ingredient of time. But Eskom must stick to the knitting if it is to survive. But at the current trajectory, with the unlawful interference of politicians, I can't see Eskom being able to survive beyond the next 12 to 18 months. And I think the audit, when it comes, it will unfortunately paint a very more bleaker picture, whereby the losses will at least be 70 billion rand plus, and not the 21 billion rand EBITDA loss that they are forecasting, but the actual losses factoring the impairments. Entity that is insolvent for all intents and purposes.
All right. So now, with Eskom wobbling and struggling to stand on its feet for years, are there investors who you think will be willing to take the risk and partner with the utility, probably take up a bit of the responsibilities to refurbish the public utility and see how some sort of overhauling can come to that particular firm? I don't know what you think about that.
Well, that has been tried in terms of trying to bring in the private sector. Unfortunately, it has come in at a cost which Eskom cannot afford. And it's a very bizarre, upset strategy. Isn't it amazing that the Nationalist Party apartheid era government had a very prudent energy policy whereof anything above 1,000 megawatts of electricity could not be procured from a private sector entity or even from any of the neighboring countries. And that strategy was very responsible because it forced Eskom to be efficient, it forced Eskom to be self-sufficient and reliant, and be the energy utility that it has become. Unfortunately, it is the democratically elected ANC government that has come up with these very bizarre policies, founded thought that you can be able to save a Eskom the size of the utility that it is through bringing in private sector players who, at the end of the day, are effectively there to lead this company into a death spiral. Eskom is in a death spiral, but one of the reasons it's in a death spiral is because of that policy of hoping that the private sector can be able to come in and invest when all the private sector players are 100% reliant on Eskom in order for them to be able to even be able to supply any service that they purport that they can be able to supply. However, one of the key problems, as I have mentioned, is that renewable energy sources are 100% redundant on the Eskom grid. And for as long as the government forces Eskom into this position where it has to procure redundant power at a cost that is 6.5 times the cost of Eskom's primary energy cost, unfortunately, is going to exacerbate a very dire situation. And as I say, lead to a Eskom that is insolvent and therefore forcing government to have to bail it out, as government has been bailing out all other state-owned entities. And that, unfortunately, is going to increase the debt burden that the country has. The sovereign debt, which now is over 5 trillion rand, and will be the 2025 will be 5.6 trillion rand. So we're going to see a debt that is perpetually on the increase, but the borrowings, the proceeds from the borrowings will effectively be plugging this bottomless hole called.
All right, Tshepo, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, so to just quickly wrap this up, because you said that the policies, implementations as regards the operations and what Eskom has to do in terms of power generation, distribution as it were, has not been optimal. So are you now saying that Eskom might not be able to achieve the debt to equity ratio of 70 to 30 that it has been, that is hoping for to happen in the year 2025? And are you also saying that it is going to be impossible for the utility to get back to its glory days where there was availability of power for households and for businesses to use to power their different ventures? Is that what you're saying?
Indeed. Well, Eskom will not be able to achieve a 70-30 debt equity ratio in the short term and even in the long run, because on the back of this 254 billion rand bailout, Eskom is now planning further borrowings in excess of 200 billion. 100 billion of that is going to go towards the development or the upgrade and refurbishment of the transmission grid. The other 100 billion or so is going to go towards the completion of the 2 newer power stations, Moody and Kusile. So they are planning on the back of this debt bailout to borrow more money. On the other hand, what they have not factored is the declining sales resultant from that. As we speak now, over 7,000 megawatts of energy demand, which Eskom would ordinarily have been the supplier thereof, that has migrated off grid. And we are seeing that on the increase. More and more households, businesses, industries are now resorted to alternative sources of energy off grid, and that has got a direct impact on the unit sales of electricity that Eskom can be able to achieve. Therefore, the declining. I think that 3 years ago, Eskom used to sell in the order of 193,000 gigawatt hours of electricity a year. That figure has gone down as low as 162,000 gigawatt hours of unit sales. That is it's a very troubling picture for Eskom, to say the least.
Pretty troubling, I must say, Tshepo. But thank you so much for joining this conversation. We hope that the government will be able to find a lasting solution to the problems that is actually plaguing Eskom at this time. But then we appreciate you talking to us.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
All right. So Moody's report signals that Eskom's debt reduction plans have the potential to decrease the financial risks that South Africa faces and positively impact government-owned establishments and South African banks, as it were. But we have been, these particular establishments have been pre-exposed to liquidity and equity shocks. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge with a long-lasting effect on these establishments, on South Africa's economy, even the citizens. So it's very, very imperative that some sort of respite or some sort of workable solutions can be put to bed for Eskom to thrive in this case. We go on a short break, and when we return, it will be time for international business stories.